Is it true that some of the greatest minds in history preferred solitude? Or is this isolation a sign of a disdain for social life, a privilege reserved for the intellectually superior? This is a question that many have wondered when looking at the lives of geniuses like Nikola Tesla, Isaac Newton, or Emily Dickinson. These individuals are known not only for their intellectual brilliance, but also for the solitude that seemed to be an inseparable part of their lives. But is this isolation something to be avoided, or is it actually a key factor that helped them achieve great accomplishments? Schopenhauer, a philosopher known for his pessimistic yet profound views, had an answer. He argued that superior intelligence naturally demands a separation from trivial conversations and superficial social connections. To him, solitude is the fate of all exceptional minds. So could it be that, as Schopenhauer said, solitude is a gift for the intellectually awakened, or is it simply a harsh form of alienation? Join us as we explore these profound insights in today's video. If this is your first time visiting our channel, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can stay updated with our latest videos on spiritual topics, inner awakening, and philosophical insights. Why did some of the greatest minds in history prefer solitude? What makes brilliant thinkers feel repulsed by social life, and is isolation a curse or a privilege reserved for the intellectually superior? These questions have echoed through time, raising intriguing debates about the nature of genius and the role of social interaction. Arthur Schopenhauer, one of the most pessimistic yet visionary philosophers of the 19th century, had an answer to these questions, and it was far from flattering to society. Schopenhauer believed that genius, by its very nature, demanded distance from the mundane and the superficial. In his view, the world was full of people driven by petty impulses, trapped in trivial conversations and meaningless distractions. These distractions, he argued, were not only unimportant, but stifling for those who possessed exceptional intellectual abilities. For Schopenhauer, intellectual superiority was inherently isolating. As he famously wrote, "Solitude is the fate of all exceptional minds." But was he right? Or is this disdain for social interaction merely a symptom of an inability to connect? When we think of some of history's greatest minds, figures like Nikola Tesla, Emily Dickinson, and Isaac Newton, we find not only examples of extraordinary intellectual achievements, but also strikingly isolated lives. These individuals were known not just for their brilliance, but for their preference for solitude, often retreating from society. Were they truly examples of intelligence that transcends the ordinary, or were they simply misunderstood souls doomed to wander the world alone? Today, we will explore Schopenhauer's ideas to better understand why intelligent people often seem indifferent to social life, and whether this distance from society is truly a form of privilege or just a sophisticated form of alienation. To begin, imagine a genius completely immersed in his own thoughts, lost in complex theories, while the world around him carries on. While others are busy discussing the weather, he is contemplating the fate of humanity. While the masses engage in trivial discussions, he is probing the nature of existence. In such moments, it's easy to see how isolation becomes inevitable. Schopenhauer believed that this detachment wasn't merely a personal preference. It was the natural consequence of intellectual superiority. According to him, the more an individual stands out intellectually, the harder it becomes to find like-minded peers who can share in deep ideas and emotions. The concerns and interests of the majority, Schopenhauer argued, are radically different from those who possess a broader, more expansive view of the world. In his words, "A man can only be himself while he is alone, and if he does not love solitude, he will not love freedom, or it is only when he is alone that he is truly free." For Schopenhauer, solitude was not merely a burden, but a refuge, an environment in which a person could truly think and explore ideas without being stifled by the demands of society. He observed that intellectuals often felt a sense of displacement when interacting with the common world. Their capacity for abstract thinking, combined with an understanding of realities that escaped general comprehension, set them apart from the masses. In a world where most people are content with surface-level interactions, the intellectual is often left feeling isolated. Schopenhauer viewed this isolation as an unfortunate but necessary consequence of intellectual life, and for him, it was not only a mark of brilliance, but a gateway to freedom and creative accomplishment. This theme of isolation as both a gift and a curse is seen in many historical figures who were far ahead of their time. Nikola Tesla, for example, spent much of his life alone, often refusing to engage with society. Tesla believed that social interactions could interfere with his work, and he preferred to remain isolated, dedicating himself to his experiments. Similarly, Friedrich Nietzsche, another philosopher who valued solitude, famously said, "The crowd is a sea in which free spirits drown." Nietzsche, like Schopenhauer, saw the intellectual as being fundamentally different from the general public, unable to find solace in the superficiality of social life. For both thinkers, solitude was not a choice but a necessity, an inevitable consequence of their intellectual pursuits. However, this kind of isolation comes with a price. Schopenhauer recognized that while solitude could be liberating for great thinkers, it could also be a source of profound alienation. The need to distance oneself from societal norms and conventions can leave individuals feeling disconnected and misunderstood. Schopenhauer himself struggled with feelings of loneliness and depression, acknowledging that intellectual superiority often made it difficult to relate to others. Many of history's greatest intellectuals, including Tesla, Nietzsche, and even Albert Einstein, went through periods of anxiety and despair. Not because they were weak, but because they saw the world in a way that most people could never begin to fathom. They were burdened with the knowledge that their intellectual pursuits set them apart. And this sense of difference can lead to a deep feeling of isolation. The central question remains, is this isolation a curse or a blessing? For Schopenhauer, the answer was clear. He believed that intellectuals should embrace their solitude as a gift, for it was only in the silence and distance from social mediocrity that they could achieve their greatest accomplishments. In a world where the majority is content with superficial conversations and distractions, the intellectual, through solitude, is able to achieve freedom. The freedom to think deeply, to explore new ideas, and to push the boundaries of human knowledge. This freedom, Schopenhauer argued, is essential for the intellectual to make meaningful contributions to society. But does that mean we should all strive for the kind of isolation that Schopenhauer and other great thinkers embraced? The truth is more nuanced. While solitude can indeed foster creativity and intellectual growth, it can also lead to feelings of loneliness and alienation, as Schopenhauer himself admitted. The balance between social interaction and intellectual solitude is delicate. Intellectuals, while they may find peace in solitude, still need human connection, even if only occasionally, to ground them in the reality of the world they are trying to change. In the modern world, the dynamics of social life have changed dramatically. We are more connected than ever through technology. But the kind of meaningful, face-to-face interactions that promote true intellectual exchange are often sacrificed for convenience and virtual communication. For contemporary thinkers, the challenge is not so much whether they should retreat into solitude, but how they can maintain their intellectual integrity while remaining engaged with the world. In many ways, modern technology has created new forms of isolation, where people can be surrounded by others but still feel deeply disconnected. So, is isolation a curse or a blessing for those with exceptional intellect? For Schopenhauer and other great thinkers, it was a blessing, a necessary condition for intellectual freedom and achievement. But for those seeking to balance genius with connection, the answer may lie somewhere in between. The solitude needed for deep thought must be tempered by the occasional need for human companionship. It is in this balance, between the quiet reflection of solitude and the vibrant exchange of ideas in society, that intellectuals can truly thrive and make their most profound contributions to the world. In the end, the relationship between intelligence and social life is complex. Some of the most brilliant minds in history have preferred isolation, not out of disdain for society, but because they sought something deeper, something beyond the trivial concerns that dominate most social interactions. Whether this isolation is a curse or a blessing ultimately depends on how the individual navigates the fine line between solitude and connection. and whether they can find a way to use their intellectual gifts to contribute meaningfully to society while maintaining their sense of freedom. For Schopenhauer, the answer was clear. Solitude was not something to fear, but something to embrace. It was the key to unlocking the full potential of the exceptional mind. Schopenhauer did not see social life as a space for genuine exchange or authentic connection, but rather as a grand theater where individuals played predefined roles, trapped in an eternal performance of appearances and selfish interests. According to him, society was nothing more than a stage where people acted for one another, hiding their true intentions behind carefully constructed masks. Sociability is, for most people, just a mask under which they hide their banality. This pessimistic view was directly linked to his main work, The World as Will and Representation, where he argued that everything we perceive is nothing more than a projection of our minds. To him, social life was just an illusion, a spectacle that distracted individuals from true knowledge about themselves and the nature of the world. Schopenhauer believed that most people were trapped in trivial concerns, status, gossip, petty power struggles, and the pursuit of recognition. In his view, the average human being was a slave to the will, a blind and irrational drive that governs our actions and keeps us stuck in an endless cycle of desires. The search for social validation was nothing more than a reflection of this uncontrollable will, and that's where the problem lies. While most people were immersed in this shallow routine, those with sharper intellect saw everything in a way that was almost cruel to them. Society seemed like a meaningless game where interactions rarely went beyond the surface. This disdain for social life was not exclusive to Schopenhauer. Other great thinkers also expressed contempt for the superficiality of society. Nietzsche, for instance, stated that convictions are more dangerous enemies of truth than lies, highlighting how people prefer to cling to illusions rather than face reality honestly. This conflict between the pursuit of knowledge and the demands of social life created an insurmountable gap between the brightest minds and the rest of humanity. The result, intellectual isolation became inevitable. But there is a side effect. Prolonged solitude can lead to disillusionment, apathy, and even contempt for the outside world. Schopenhauer was aware of this and warned that for those who saw beyond the social illusion, the only alternative was to accept this reality and learn to live with it. But how does this isolation manifest in daily life? Why do intellectually superior individuals so often feel frustrated with social interaction? In the next section, we will explore the clash between genius and mediocrity and how it pushes great thinkers away from ordinary life. Schopenhauer did not mince words when describing his view of humanity. To him, most people were driven by superficial and selfish interests, with no inclination for contemplation or deep thought. This created an inevitable chasm between those endowed with high intelligence and the vast majority whom he saw as distracted by trivialities and frivolities. Mediocrity generally recognizes only itself. Genius, on the other hand, sees mediocrity but finds itself alone. This intellectual isolation occurs because the thinker is, by nature, someone who seeks to understand the world in depth. While most people are preoccupied with trivial matters, such as status, gossip, or fleeting entertainment, the genius is trying to unravel the mysteries of existence. And when they attempt to share their ideas, they often encounter indifference or misunderstanding. This explains why so many great thinkers have felt frustrated with society. Schopenhauer himself despised interacting with ordinary people, believing that the mediocrity of the majority stood in stark contrast to the genius of the few. This sentiment resonates with Voltaire's famous remark, "The secret of being boring is to tell everything you know." The problem is not just a matter of communication difficulties, but a fundamental difference in interests. The genius seeks universal truths, while the majority seeks pleasure and distraction. This conflict is unavoidable. To Schopenhauer, this intellectual gap made social interactions burdensome for those with elevated minds. We can observe this dynamic in numerous historical figures. Nikola Tesla, for instance, avoided social events and trivial interactions, considering them a waste of time. Isaac Newton was known for his reclusiveness and impatience with mundane conversations. Even Albert Einstein, one of the most celebrated scientists in history, admitted that he preferred solitude over the company of people who did not share his interest in deep ideas. But this distancing from society doesn't happen solely by the genius's choice. Often, society itself rejects those who think differently. Innovative and unconventional thinking frequently causes discomfort and resistance. Schopenhauer called this the resentment of mediocrity, the tendency of ordinary people to despise or attack what they do not understand or what makes them feel inferior. Thus, the genius not only withdraws by choice, but is also pushed away by the hostility of the world around them. This forced solitude can lead to feelings of alienation and even a disdain for social interaction. In light of this, a fundamental question arises. If the world is a hostile place for great thinkers, how should they deal with this reality? Schopenhauer believed there was a solution, and it did not lie in trying to fit into society, but rather in embracing and cultivating solitude as a refuge for thought and contemplation. Is loneliness a destiny or a choice? For Schopenhauer, it was both. He saw solitude as an inevitable consequence of superior intelligence, but also as an opportunity for intellectual and spiritual growth. The common man cannot bear solitude because he only feels good in the company of others, but the elevated man seeks solitude because in it, he finds himself. This perspective brings us to an essential point. Loneliness is not a punishment, but a privilege. It offers the thinker a chance to immerse themselves in their own ideas without distractions, without having to conform to the empty social conventions that dominate everyday life. It is in this silent space that creativity flourishes and understanding deepens. Many of history's greatest thinkers, scientists, and artists made solitude their inseparable companion. Emily Dickinson spent most of her life isolated in her home, dedicating herself entirely to writing. Kant was known for his meticulous routine and his disdain for social events. Beethoven, as his deafness progressed, found in solitude the strength to compose some of the most powerful symphonies in history. Solitude not only allows for deep thought, but also preserves the authenticity of genius. Schopenhauer believed that by becoming too involved with society, a brilliant mind risks getting lost in distractions and compromising its clarity of vision. This perspective strongly resonates with the Buddhist concept of detachment. Buddhism, one of Schopenhauer's greatest philosophical influences, teaches that attachment to the external world and social interactions often leads to suffering. True growth occurs through introspection and distancing oneself from the illusions of the material world. However, there is a dilemma in this choice. Human beings are, by nature, social creatures. The need for belonging is part of our biology, and prolonged solitude can lead to anguish and melancholy. Even the greatest thinkers, no matter how much they valued seclusion, suffered from the lack of meaningful connections. Nietzsche, for example, who also saw solitude as a path to greatness, admitted that it could be painful. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he describes the philosopher as a hermit who descends from the mountain to share his wisdom, only to be met with rejection and misunderstanding. This dilemma is real. Withdrawing from society brings freedom, but it also carries an existential burden that is difficult to bear. Schopenhauer, however, had a solution to this problem. He believed that while a genius could never fully fit into society, there was a way to interact with the world without being affected by its mediocrity. By adopting a philosophical detachment, a kind of emotional neutrality that allowed one to coexist with others without becoming too involved. This strategy leads us to the final point. How can we navigate the world without being consumed by its superficiality? If having a brilliant mind means ending up alone, can we still engage with society without losing ourselves in the process? How do great thinkers manage to navigate society without being suffocated by its pervasive superficiality? Schopenhauer provided an answer through the strategy of detachment, specifically philosophical detachment. He believed that happiness is reserved for those who are self-sufficient, who don't rely on external validation or conform to societal pressures. For Schopenhauer, the key was not about trying to fit in or changing the people around you, but rather developing a sense of serene distance from the world. An attitude akin to a detached observer studying reality without letting it sway their own thoughts and emotions. This concept of detachment doesn't imply isolation or disengagement. Rather, it's about engaging with the world in a way that allows the thinker to maintain their mental clarity. Instead of resisting the mediocrity and superficiality of society, Schopenhauer suggested that the thinker should face it with the same mindset a scientist adopts during an experiment, approaching it with curiosity, but without emotional involvement. In practice, this means accepting the trivialities of daily social life without irritation, recognizing the intellectual limitations of most people without letting it lead to frustration, and preserving one's mental independence, free from the need for social approval or validation. Schopenhauer's philosophy offers a powerful solution for those who feel overwhelmed by the shallowness of social interactions. By adopting this calm, analytical perspective, individuals can maintain their intellectual autonomy and find peace in their own thoughts, even in a world dominated by distractions and the superficiality of popular culture. This way, one can participate in the world without being consumed by it, choosing when to engage and when to retreat into a space that nurtures deeper reflection. This strategy is similar to the Stoic approach, which advocated controlling emotions in the face of adversity. Marcus Aurelius, one of the greatest exponents of Stoicism, wrote in his Meditations, "Give yourself a gift, the gift of indifference toward what is beyond your control. The world will always be a place full of futile distractions and empty conversations, but it is up to the individual to decide how much of it deserves their attention." A thinker should not completely isolate themselves from society, but rather engage with it strategically, absorbing only what is useful and discarding what is irrelevant. Despite having no patience for society, Schopenhauer did not believe that total isolation was the solution. He knew that even great thinkers needed some level of human contact, whether to exchange ideas or simply to avoid sinking into complete loneliness. The key, according to him, was to carefully choose whom to connect with and keep interactions minimal, just enough to get by in the world without going insane. This philosophy is still relevant today, in a world filled with digital distractions, fake news, and superficial relationships. Knowing how to filter information and interactions is essential. Intelligence is not just about understanding the world, but about navigating it without losing oneself. Schopenhauer teaches us that instead of lamenting the lack of connection with most people, we should see it as a sign of our intellectual freedom. After all, solitude can be a burden, but it is also a privilege, an opportunity to explore our own thoughts without external interference. And now, the question remains, do you prefer to adapt to the world, or accept it as it is, and preserve your intellectual freedom? If you've made it this far, you've likely begun to realize that the connection between intelligence and isolation is not just some quirky twist of fate, but rather a natural outcome of deep, reflective thinking. Schopenhauer demonstrated that for great minds, solitude is often far more comforting than being surrounded by the crowd. Not because they're arrogant, but because the superficial nature of social interactions can be draining for those who see beyond mere appearances. The more intelligent a person is, the more likely they are to seek solitude, not out of a desire to disconnect, but because they crave the mental space to explore ideas that the average person might not appreciate. But does this mean that being alone is the only path to greatness? Not necessarily. The key lies in understanding that solitude shouldn't be viewed as a punishment, but rather as a sanctuary. Being alone doesn't imply abandonment or loneliness. It provides an invaluable opportunity for personal growth. It's in this quiet space that one can think freely, reflect deeply, and cultivate ideas without the distractions and pressures of the outside world. In solitude, one can find clarity and purpose, unlocking the potential for creativity and insight that might otherwise be lost amidst the noise of society. And perhaps this is the true test of intelligence, knowing how to balance the world and introspection, choosing when to connect and when to step back. Schopenhauer gives us the key to this freedom, but it is up to each of us to decide how to use it. If you've made it this far, I'm sure that at some point you've felt that strange mix of freedom and isolation that Schopenhauer described. Intelligence can be a refuge, but it can also be a prison, right? But you know what? There's something deeply liberating about accepting that not every silence needs to be filled, that not every connection is worth the effort. You're not alone on this journey, even if the path feels solitary. After all, as old Arthur once said, loneliness isn't the problem is the wrong company. I remember this one time when, after hours lost in a book, I caught myself staring at the wall, reflecting on some grand idea, until someone interrupted my philosophical moment to ask if I had seen the latest reality show or heard the hottest gossip. That's when it hit me. Wanting deeper conversations isn't arrogance, it's a necessity. If you've ever been through this, you know how frustrating it is to feel like you're speaking another language, like your mind is sailing across the ocean while everyone else insists on splashing around in a puddle. But you know what? There's a bright side to it. You don't have to get lost in the noise. You have the privilege of choosing your solitude. Modern life, with social media, TikTok, and the latest trends, is often lacking in quality conversations and, at times, personal reflections on life. Do you agree with me? We want to sincerely thank you for taking the time to watch the video in its entirety. If you're interested in exploring more topics on spirituality, inner transformation, or mind philosophy, don't forget to subscribe to the Top Hidden Knowledge channel for more content on wisdom, spirituality, and personal growth. Or if you have time, check out other videos on this channel. Until next time.